Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 7th of December. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 287 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. President Vladimir Putin has said Russia will defend ourselves with all the means at our disposal and warned that the threat of nuclear war is on the rise in an address to his Human Rights Council. The NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has said that Russia is attempting to freeze the fighting in Ukraine over the winter in order to prepare its forces for a renewed assault early in the new year. Dmytro Zhivitsky, the governor of Sumy region on the Russian border, said that several people were wounded when Russian forces fired 226 shells onto 7 communities during the day. And Ukraine's culture minister, Alexander Tkachenko, has called on the country's Western allies to boycott Russian culture. The Kremlin said that Vladimir Putin met senior officials on Tuesday to discuss domestic security, and Russia was taking necessary measures to fend off more Ukrainian attacks. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said it had not enabled Ukraine to carry out strikes inside Russia after a spate of drone attacks on military-linked facilities deep within Russian territory. The UK has ordered several thousand NLAW anti-tank weapons to replace the 7,000 donated to Ukraine over the past year. Belarus has said it plans to move military equipment and security forces on Wednesday and Thursday in what it says are checks on its response to possible acts of terrorism. Poland is preparing to deploy the German Patriot air defence system on its territory after Berlin refused to place the system in Ukraine. And Europe is likely to scrape through this winter without cutting off gas customers despite reduced Russian supplies. At least 441 civilians were killed by Russian forces during the first weeks of the war in Ukraine, according to a report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Ukraine's Health Ministry has asked regional authorities to consider suspending non-essential surgeries and hospitalizations due to rolling power blackouts. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular friend to the programme. William Duguid is an activist, a commentator and a blogger, and he also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm fine, thank you very much. I hope you're keeping well too.
I am indeed, thank you, William. We're very grateful to you for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening. Our first story this evening is that a new Ipsos Mori poll is showing a significant increase in support for Scottish independence. 56% would vote yes and 44% no in an immediate Indy Ref 2. That means that yes is up 6 points since May. The poll shows a majority say they intend to vote for a pro-independence party, either the SNP at 51% or the Greens at 3%. Labour is in second place at 25%, with the Conservatives in third place on 13%, much lower than the 25% they achieved at the 2019 general election. Support from the SNP rises to 53% if a general election is framed as a de facto referendum. The SNP deputy leader Keith Brown said, "This latest poll shows a clear majority of people support Scottish independence, and the momentum behind yes is rocketing. For too long, Tories and Labour have claimed now is not the time for the people of Scotland to choose their own future. This poll shows clearly the people think now is the time. The Westminster parties need to recognise and respect that." He went on, "As the chaos of Westminster control wreaks untold damage on Scotland, inflicted by successive Tory governments that we didn't vote for, it's no surprise that support for independence continues to rise." So, William, the SNP has hailed this latest polling figures, which follow the news that the Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a fresh referendum without Westminster consent. Emily Gray, who's the managing director of Ipsos Mori in Scotland, commented, Whether this is a temporary bounce in the wake of the recent Supreme Court judgment or a longer-lasting trend remains to be seen. So what do you think, William? Is it a reaction to the Supreme Court telling Scots that they can't vote for their own future, or is there something else going on here?
It's a fairly marked shift in the polls, both in terms of the other polls we've been hearing about recently, and also the last Ipsos Mori poll, which was a number of months ago. And with the fieldwork having been done after the Supreme Court decision, one can't help but think that that is part of the reason for these figures. It could still be an outlier. We can't be certain until I think we've seen it confirmed by other polls that shift in voter attitudes is beginning to happen. I think it's a reaction to the Supreme Court decision on one score, but I think also the reaction to the independence movement's reaction to it. We have seen the rallies, we have seen now moves on several fronts to start moving the independence campaign ahead. The Alba Party was very quick off the mark with its National Assembly in Perth, starting on Saturday. The SNP is making moves both to have its internal discussion about independence, but also certainly in Perthshire is beginning to make moves actually to campaign under the Yes Scot banner next year, I believe. And of course, there's the Aberdeen Independence Movement coming up with another big Road to Independence Progress Conference in February. So all of that is happening and being heard about and is being discussed. And I think if voters see some sort of progress and some sort of campaigning going on, that does positively affect the figures. So the challenge for the independence movement is to keep the momentum up over Christmas and into the new year. And if we can sustain those figures and begin to build on them, then I think we might have something going for us. But certainly a very encouraging early sign, and let's hope that later polls do indeed bear it out.
Thanks, William. Treating the next election as a de facto referendum on independence appears unlikely to dent the SNP's vote share, Ipsos Mori have said today, with 53% of those likely to vote saying they will back the SNP in that situation. Ipsos Mori's managing director in Scotland, Emily Gray, said that the SNP's plan to fight the next general election as a de facto referendum remains a high-risk strategy, but she went on to say that the indication from this poll is that, at this stage at least, this strategy is not harming their electoral chances. So do you think, William, is the prospect of a de facto referendum as part of an election, is that beginning to persuade folks, do you think?
Maybe. I would still counsel caution here. Again, I would want to see more polls because the other polls prior to this have been showing figures within the margin of error about a plebiscitary election. And also, this poll is people 16 and over, and therefore it includes 16 and 17-year-olds who will be specifically unable to participate in a Westminster election. James Kelly of Scott Goes Pop, who's somebody whose opinion I value, is still arguing that probably the most promising strategy would still be to engineer an early Holyrood election next year, potentially even in the autumn. And he's citing straws in the wind from those other subsamples that have come out in the last couple of weeks as his reasoning behind that. I certainly wouldn't wish to be taking that decision, but I would comment that a Holyrood route, if we can pull it off, does leave the timing in our hands, whereas a Westminster election could be sprung on us, and that might not be very pleasant. But I think it does show that people are not totally against the idea of a Westminster plebiscitary election. And that was one of the hurdles for me, whether people would buy into it or simply say, well, you can't make an election about this. Certainly that's been the line that our unionist opponents have been taking, that somehow it's unjustifiable or illegal for Scotland to do this. A party can stand on anything it likes in an election, and that nonsense should stop.
Very much so, William. Thank you. Some sage advice there, and undoubtedly, you and I will be discussing these political strategies and moves over the coming weeks as we progress into 2023, as you say. Let's move on to our next item now, however, because the UK Border Force staff are to strike over the festive holidays at airports across the country in a dispute over pay and conditions their union has announced. Passport checks at Heathrow, Gatwick, Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff and Birmingham airports will be among those disrupted, the PCS union has said. Days affected will include the period from the 23rd of December to Boxing Day inclusive, and from the 28th of December until New Year's Eve. Union members are also expected to strike at Newhaven Port in East Sussex and at the English Highways Agency on strike dates coordinated with RMT action on the railways, the union said. This strike is expected to affect hundreds of thousands of people planning to go on holiday. The government has been preparing for the strike by training 600 soldiers to check passports instead. The announcement came on the same day that Rishi Sunak promised new tough laws to curb the impact of industrial action, which he criticised unreasonable unions. Mark Serwotka, the PCS General Secretary, announced the dates as part of the union's national campaign for a 10% pay rise, pensions justice, job security, and no cuts to redundancy terms. The strike comes after 100,000 PCS members in 214 government departments and other public bodies voted to take action in support of their 10% pay rise, pensions, job security, and no cuts to redundancy terms. So, William, the PCS General Secretary Mark Serwotka said the government can stop these strikes tomorrow if it puts money on the table. Like so many workers, our members are struggling with the cost of living crisis. They are desperate. They are being told there is no money for them, while they watch ministers giving out government contracts worth billions of pounds to their mates. So, William, does this suggest that members of the PCS union are now striking because of Michelle Mone?
Steady on. That would be like the butterfly effect writ large. No, it's simply part of the general picture. We are getting closer and closer to what would be tantamount to a general strike with disputes over pay because people cannot afford the cost of living. Just breaking out all over. And this is part of a general civil service push. They got an 86.2% vote in favour of strike action. And in many geographical areas, they also hit the legal turnout threshold of 50%, which is quite important. I think they did that in 124 employer areas. And they're ready for a fight. They have a significant strike fund in hand. So, yeah, it's all going down and it's going to happen. And something needs to give. I don't understand exactly why the government don't want to engage. It could be that they're waiting for public opinion to turn. But the signs right now are that it's not entirely clear that it will turn. I think there's a lot of sympathy because people identify with folks struggling with a high cost of living. So it's not going to be an easy few months and not an easy winter, I think.
No, that's a very good point, William. Now, you started using the G word there, the general word, and I was going to ask you, there are a range of different civil servants now planning to strike, and that's on top of a range of other sectors and industries as well. So do you think, is the prospect of a general strike, is that prospect increasing?
It might kind of happen by accident because I think even the general strike of 1926 wasn't everything. It was just enough for it to affect all sorts of services. So the temperature is going to go up if the government does not engage properly. I get the impression, for example, with the Scottish government that where there's industrial action, they're doing their very best to engage. I absolutely don't get those signals from the UK government. Now, again, it comes down to whether this is calculation or whether there's something else behind it. Robert Peston seems to be under the notion in Twitter today. He was saying that the government is playing hardball because the money has run out and they really can't do anything but just brazen it out. I don't buy that because it runs counter to the narratives of many economic experts who maintain, I think rightly, that if you have control over your own currency, your money can never run out. There may be other problems involved with constantly drawing from the magic money tree, but you can spend money to get over particular difficulties. And they don't seem to want to do that. So I think it must be more political calculation. And it could be that, yeah, both sides have to play hardball, and we could see a lot more of perhaps a modern day winter of discontent. I hesitate to use the term because in numerical terms of days lost at this stage, it's nowhere near the 1970s levels. But for an electorate that's not used to that type of sustained industrial action, already stressed by financial pressures, it may really start to look as if we're in meltdown, and discontent may be what the winter is all about.
That's a very good point, William. I think discontent just about sums it up. You're absolutely right. Thank you. Let's move on to our next item now, because the government has ruled out making any intervention in the markets to help farmers or consumers with high food prices, the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey, has said. Food prices have soared in the past year, in part owing to higher input prices such as energy, fertiliser and animal feed. Last month, food price inflation hit a fresh high of 12.4%, of course with the poorest households hit the hardest. Farmers have also complained that supermarkets are driving down the prices they pay to producers at the farm gate, leaving them making tiny profits. A report published last week from the food charity Sustain found that farmers made less than 1/10 of a penny in profit from a supermarket loaf, which is sold to consumers for £1.14, and only a penny in profit from a £2.50 block of mild cheddar cheese. But Coffey, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, since Rishi Sunak took office in September, refused to criticise supermarkets and said the government would not be taking action. She acknowledged the growing demand for food banks around the country and pointed to steps such as the forthcoming increase in benefits and measures to reduce energy bills, but declined to promise any further support. She said, "It is not the role of government to provide free food." So, William, the final statement I read there from Therese Coffey was made in the context of the increasing demand for food banks and the increasing pressures on food banks, both with their own increasing input costs and a drop-off in people donating to them because people are struggling. Because this statement, "It's not the role of government to provide free food," was in the context of the operation of food banks, is this just Therese Coffey? It's not virtue signalling, hate signalling to the Tory faithful and to the right-wing press?
It has to be seen in context, but it's not a good look, is it, to be saying those things? It is, in my view, the role of government to ensure food security for its population. And right now, regrettably, food banks are part of that food security. Right now, keeping farmers in business is part of that food security, and supermarkets driving prices down so that you're reaching Dickensian levels of profit, 1/10 of a penny on a loaf. I can understand why the supermarkets are doing it from a business perspective, but it's not on, because the ultimate effect may be the strangulation of the farming sector. That is a huge food security issue. I'm not even going to, I will say it, but I'm not going to harp on about Brexit, but that doesn't help at all. The food sector has been suffering deaths by 1,000 cuts in the last 3 years with that word that I said I wouldn't say again, with COVID, with staff shortages stemming from, yes, that word that I said I wouldn't say again. And it really needs a much more considered approach from the government, because this is a fundamental part of how we get through our current difficulties as a society. And I still think the government is wanting to be seen to be playing hardball with producers, with workers, with everybody in sight, and a little bit more compassion and cooperation, and the realization that we're in special circumstances is really what's required here.
That's a very good point, William. It struck me that we were discussing a moment ago the Westminster government, refusing to engage with the PCS and other trade unions. We're now seeing, in this context, we're seeing the Secretary of State refusing to criticise supermarkets and refusing to intervene in the markets. So there's almost a theme developing here. In the context of this story, however, do you think this refusal is it simply in order to protect shareholders and supermarkets, who apparently are more important than food producers to a Tory government? And also, you were talking about the security in the food supply chain. How long do you think the domestic food supply chain can survive being abused in this manner?
I dread to think. I'm looking at what Ruth Watson has been saying about Scotland's farming sector in the last few weeks. I dread to think, because you don't just see the damaging effects of what's going on this year, you see those damaging effects working through into future years, and our overall capacity to feed ourselves in the way either to which we become accustomed or in the way that we require is damaged significantly, and it's a thing that isn't fixed quickly. So yeah, I really think we need to be much more creative about how we look at our financial situation and how we protect our farming sector, and I see no sign of that at the moment.
Thank you, William. For our next item, we'll move on to a sector of the economy which apparently is more important to the Westminster government, because the UK financial services industry is facing another post-Brexit blow after the EU moved to require firms to settle more financial risk-reducing trades within the bloc. The plan centres on trades in securities known as derivatives and on financial market clearinghouses, the intermediaries that enable the transfer of funds to sellers and financial products to buyers. Handling trillions of transactions each year, they are deemed an essential part of financial market plumbing, which reduces risk. Since the vote to leave the EU in 2016, the subject has become a battleground, as Brussels seeks to end what it sees as an over-reliance of European firms on London for euro-denominated derivative trading. Under draft proposals issued by the European Commission today, financial firms will be required to clear a yet-to-be-determined proportion of systemic derivatives via active accounts in EU clearinghouses. The minimum requirement will be set by the EU regulator, the European Securities and Markets Authority, 1 year after the law is adopted. So, William, firstly, in a more general sense, earlier today, Stéphane Boujnah, who's the chief executive of Euronext, one of the biggest foreign exchange trading businesses, said, London used to be the largest financial centre in the European Union, and everybody liked it. Today, London is the largest financial centre of the United Kingdom. So do you think, is Stéphane Boujnah correct, and is he identifying a distinct and definite direction of travel for the square mile and London as a financial centre?
Yeah, I think there's still perhaps some lingering affection for London, but otherwise the lights are going out all over the square mile, and increasingly places like Paris seem to be now where it's at in terms of financial transactions. So London's oyster and champagne bars will be like funeral parlours if we're not careful. Um, and yeah, it's almost an inevitable result of what we've done to ourselves. History will record Brexit. I will now say it regularly, don't worry. History will record Brexit as the greatest act of self-harm to all sorts of parts of our economy and our society that we've ever inflicted on ourselves. It's a nonsense, and there will be continuing effects like this over the next few years. This may not ultimately happen because it is a draft proposal, and I don't think the decision will be made until 2024, and it will be the political leadership of the next European Commission that makes it. But at some point, the road is going to run out for the financial services. So needs to be some thinking there.
Thank you, William. And nevertheless, despite repeated Brussels pleas to reduce dependence on the UK, some European banks and financial firms continue to use London's clearinghouses. In a report published last December, the EU regulator, the ESMA, concluded that there are 3 UK clearinghouses which are of substantial systemic importance to the EU and could pose financial stability risks. So, given the relatively less regulated sector in the UK, and of course noises from the Tory government about reducing regulation for the financial services sector even further, is it a surprise at all that the EU, who are much more minded to continue and to develop careful regulatory regimes for the financial services sector after the catastrophic collapse in 2008, is it a surprise that the EU is seeking to identify systemic risks and to regulate them?
No, it's not. And the danger always with the whole Brexit idea is that steadily standards slip. And if your standards slip, it doesn't just affect your internal trades, etc. It actually affects people's willingness to deal with you. So no, it's no surprise. The EU doesn't want to be working in cowboy territory. It's, I think, often been accused of being a little bit too cautious, but we've seen the effects of not being cautious in 2008 and in several other wee frightening events. So I think the EU is perfectly right, and we'll see what happens here, because what you described with the 3 clearinghouses being particularly favoured is, I think, part of that lingering, it's not quite affection, but that lingering feeling that London is just the right place. But it won't last. Things evolve, things change. And as soon as Paris and other places in Europe get to grips with handling financial transactions more and become more the natural home of them, then nature will take its course.
As you say, William, markets move on. And in addition to markets moving on, we should move on as well, because the Northern Ireland Assembly can legislate to create buffer zones around abortion clinics to protect users and staff. The UK's highest court has ruled. The Supreme Court's unanimous judgment means the Assembly can proceed with the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Northern Ireland Bill, which criminalises people who enter the specified areas and influence people attending clinics. The Attorney-General for Northern Ireland argued that Clause 5.2 of the bill was a disproportionate interference with the freedom of conscience, speech and assembly of anti-abortion protesters and demonstrators, which are protected under Articles 9, 10 and 11, respectively, of the European Convention on Human Rights, and so was outside the Assembly's legislative competence. However, Wednesday's written judgment by Lord Reid said the restrictions were in pursuit of a legitimate aim, promoting public health, and so were compatible with the ECHR rights of anti-abortion protesters. Campaigners in Scotland have hailed the UK Supreme Court's decision. Scottish Green MSP Gillian Mackay said it set a vital precedent for her own bill at Holyrood, which seeks to introduce similar buffer zones around reproductive health clinics in Scotland. So, William, excuse me, one of the other participants in the litigation was a pro-life group called Precious Life, and their founder Bernadette Smith said, in fact, these abortion zones legislation is so broad and sweeping that it will be a crime to do anything outside an abortion centre which might influence a person in their decision to attend. Holding a sign, distributing leaflets, talking at a woman to offer her help, or praying outside an abortion centre will now be a crime. Maybe it's just me, William. Any problem with any of that?
I think it shouldn't. Abortion is difficult. It's not an easy decision for anybody to take. Any woman who has an abortion will have thought deeply about it, will be very torn about it, will be in a very difficult and fragile state. And the last thing they need is somebody getting in their faces. And if you think having a placard or ostentatiously praying for them is going to help, I advise you to have a wee study of human psychology. It's absolutely fine, in my view, for there to be safe zones where protest doesn't happen, because you're entitled to protest about the legality of abortion and to have the law changed if you wish by the usual democratic means, but you are not entitled to cause harassment and upset. And you cannot possibly guess what harassment or upset you might be causing by what you seem to think are innocent actions. So I'm all for legislation for safe zones. I'm glad this has got through. I hope the same will happen in Scotland, and that we continue to have sensible decisions on issues such as abortion, and that we treat everyone with respect, compassion, and understanding.
Thank you, William. Let's move on now, because responding to the Climate Change Committee's Scottish Progress Report 2022, the Net Zero Secretary Michael Matheson welcomed the Climate Change Committee's report, calling it a timely reminder of the scale of the challenge faced by the Scottish Government, industry and civil society if we are going to succeed in reducing emissions and playing a role in limiting global warming. Mr. Matheson said, "We fully acknowledge it will require truly transformational action across our society and economy, driven by government, as part of a national effort to tackle the climate emergency. Progress has been made. Scotland is already more than halfway to net zero, but we are now entering the most challenging part of the journey to date, with a need to halve our emissions again within the next 8 years. Significant steps have been taken in recent years to put in place the policy frameworks that will drive action and change on the ground. For example, plans to spend at least £1.8 billion over this Parliament to decarbonise homes and buildings, facilitate the transition to renewable and low-carbon sources of energy, free bus travel for under-22s, and an updated national planning framework that promotes developments that reduce carbon emissions. The action we are taking now will deliver significant emissions reductions in years to come." He continued, "However, in many areas progress on reducing emissions in Scotland is dependent on decisions taken by the UK Government. They have not gone far enough, fast enough. The Scottish Government will continue to push the UK Government to deliver progress on areas that are currently reserved." He concluded, "We know that Scotland's targets are amongst the most stretching in the world, but it is right to be continually ambitious on an issue that will affect our future generations." So, William, I had a look at the recommendations in this year's report and thought that we might look at a couple of them perhaps this evening. The first one I saw was that the recommendation from the Climate Committee is to increase transparency around the government's expected pathways to net zero. The recommendation is that this involves publishing more details on the assumptions that underpin the pathways and how the abatement set out in the Scottish Climate Change Plan update will be achieved by the policies, setting out the quantified abatement expected to be achieved by each policy. Now that sounds pretty rigorous and it sounds pretty transparent as well to me. Is that a sensible way for the next stage in our transition to net zero to be managed and to be communicated?
I think it's good to be able to quantify what you're doing and to reach a broad understanding of the population about what you're trying to do, because then your actions make sense in that context. I also think that the Scottish Government sometimes doesn't give enough information and isn't transparent enough about what it's trying to do. And I can understand why they do that, because sometimes talking in detail about your targets and how you're going to achieve them gives your opponents a stick with which to beat you. And we have a political culture in this country always of beating on the government. Well, maybe we have that everywhere, but it's particularly strong in Scotland. However, I do think that the Scottish Government could go a little bit further in just advising people about where it's going and how it's getting there, and emphasising how stretching the targets are. I mean, I think one of the things that the committee said today is that possibly the 2030 end of the targets is too ambitious, and we should revisit the targets for the 2020s. The later targets, fine, but don't bite off more than you can chew, I thought was the underlying message in some of what the committee was saying. But broadly, yep, more information the better. Let's do this together as a society.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, William.
And one other recommendation we'll look at quickly was that the government should publish developed plans to deliver energy efficiency improvements and low carbon heating in residential buildings, which plans have to be aligned with Scotland's ambitious targets. The committee says that this will require a combination of incentives and regulation, including using tenancy and ownership changes as trigger points for a change. Policy should also factor in the UK government's proposals for a market-based mechanism for low-carbon heat. Now, apart from the considerable imperative of the climate crisis, given the cost of energy at the moment, you would think that plans to deliver energy efficiency improvements would be very much pushing at an open door.
Yes, you would. And I think that this is an area that they should concentrate on. Decarbonising buildings is behind schedule. There are big funding commitments and they're welcome, but it's not yet enough to get to where we want to be by certainly 2030. I'm waiting for Common Wheel. This is the point in the evening when I blow my Common Wheel trumpet again. I'm waiting for Common Wheel to get stuck into this topic in its Friday newsletter, which it sends out, because they have some very, very strong views on the amount that you need to put into in terms of resources and in terms of building up skills, etc., in decarbonising homes, amongst other things. It's all in the Common Home Plan. And so I'll be interested to see what their take on it is when that comes out. But yeah, I would certainly say that it's an area that needs concentrating on. And we're going to feel that over the next few days as it gets colder, I'm sure.
Very much so, William, and we'll touch on the weather before we finish this evening at the end of the programme. But we'll come to Europe now for our next item, because an alleged far-right plot led by a German aristocrat to overthrow the state that sought the backing of the Russian government has been thwarted in Germany after a series of dawn raids across the country. 25 people, including a 71-year-old prince, a retired military commander, and an acting judge, and a former MP for the far-right Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, were planning a violent overthrow of the state, including an armed attack on the parliament, inspired by the storming of the US Capitol. That's according to prosecutors. The group was apparently driven by an ideology by the deep state conspiracy theories of QAnon and the Reichsbürger Empire Citizens movement, which denies the right of the modern Germany to exist. It was planning to renegotiate the country's post-Second World War settlement, insisting that the Deutsche Reich still had legitimacy despite having ended in 1945. Nancy Faeser, Germany's interior minister, called the group the enemies of democracy, saying it was as yet unclear as to how advanced its plans had been or how likely it was to have succeeded. She said the government would respond against such plots with the full force of the law, adding, the investigations provide a glimpse into the abyss of a terrorist threat from the Reichsbürger milieu. So, William, firstly, Prince Heinrich was named by police as a suspected ringleader. They say that the group planned to install Heinrich as Germany's new leader, according to prosecutors, and had already contacted Russian officials with the aim to negotiate a new order once the German government had been overthrown by force. However, the prosecutors have also said that there's no evidence that the Russian persons contacted responded positively to the request from Prince Heinrich. So one thing struck me as curious about this story. Why do you think the prosecutors are mentioning or ghosting Vladimir Putin in this story, as if this story wasn't scary enough as it is?
I think they have an interest in making it scary. I can't know, but I have a feeling that it's very doubtful that this group could actually have done anything of substance in terms of overthrowing the state. They could have carried out atrocities, possibly, if they had the resources to do it. But it does sound, to a certain extent, like the security services and the government proving their worth by having uncovered something, I have to say. I may be wrong. We may look back in future years and think, what an idiot I was to be even thinking these things. But it looks like a very weird story to me. And the Russian connection is like the icing on the cake there. Make it about Putin and everybody will believe it because Putin's the bad guy. So I'm a skeptic, I'm afraid.
I did wonder. It did strike me as a curious thing to be, as you say, to be icing the cake with the ghost of Putin in the background. But coming back to the issues at play here, the German Justice Minister Marco Buschmann described the raids this morning as an anti-terrorism operation. Because he said that the suspects may have planned an armed attack on the institutions of the state, including the parliament. And prosecutors said that those arrested allegedly formed a terrorist organisation. So it struck me that's what it was. It was a terrorist organisation with terrorist aims, and yet not a Muslim in sight. Do you think is the threat posed by the extremist far right played down or suppressed too much in the West at the moment?
Yes, I think it is. Terrorism comes from all angles. And yes, even a small number of people could have done a lot of damage, and that's terrorism. We should get out of our box about how we think terrorism is, because, yeah, it comes from so many angles, and this is yet another. The far right in all sorts of countries is currently a problem, and don't rule it out happening in the UK as time goes on, because you can just see the beginnings of it in some of the fascistic tendencies of the current government. But I think this story is probably a storm in a teacup, but I can see the sensitivity of the German authorities and I can totally understand it.
That's a very good point, William. Thank you. We'll move on now, though, because the Democratic incumbent, Raphael Warnock, has won the Georgia Senate runoff, securing his first term and delivering a 51st seat to bolster his party's majority in the chamber. Associated Press called the race about 3.5 hours after polls closed in Georgia, as Warnock led the Republican candidate, Herschel Walker, by approximately 40,000 votes. Shortly after that, Warnock took to the stage at his campaign's victory party to thank his supporters. The senior pastor at the Atlanta church where Martin Luther King Jr. once preached, Warnock has held one of Georgia's 2 Senate seats since winning a special election in 2021. As he began his remarks in Atlanta, supporters chanted 6 more years. Warnock told the crowd, after a hard-fought campaign, or should I say campaigns, it is my honour to utter the 4 most powerful words ever spoken in a democracy. The people have spoken. Joe Biden called Warnock to congratulate him, describing his victory as a defeat of Republican extremism and Donald Trump's Make America Great Again philosophy. Warnock's victory does give Democrats a crucial 51st seat, allowing them to abandon their current power-sharing agreement with Republicans. A 51 to 49 seat majority will also provide some wiggle room when it comes to close committee votes and nomination fights. That new dynamic could make the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, less reliant on centrists like Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona to pass legislation and to confirm nominees. So, William, we were talking a moment ago about extremism in Germany, and here we have Joe Biden calling the successful candidate in this election for the Senate and describing his victory as a defeat of Republican extremism and Donald Trump. Do you think, has Republican extremism been defeated?
Not necessarily. If you look at the other statewide races in Georgia, Republicans did sweep them. This could be a very poor choice of candidate in Herschel Walker because he didn't strike me as the best candidate. That said, there is a pattern in the elections in the states of Trump-endorsed candidates almost universally having a poor performance. So, it's possibly the beginning of the end for Trump, but it's not the beginning of the end for extremism, because what comes after Trump? And the name that keeps cropping up in that regard for me is Ron DeSantis, who is young, who has many attitudes that would be pretty well synonymous with Trump, but most importantly, who appears to have brains. And that would worry me in a 2024 election scenario.
You're absolutely right to be raising those concerns, William. That's a very good point. And as it happens, for our next item, we're going to look a little bit more at what the prospects for Donald J. Trump might be, because a jury in New York has convicted the Trump Organization of criminal tax fraud in a stinging rebuke of the former US president's company. Although Donald Trump was not personally on trial, prosecutors in the case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney insisted that he was fully aware of the long-running scheme in which they said executives were enriched by off-the-books perks to make up for lower salaries, thereby reducing the company's tax liabilities. This was a case about greed and cheating, Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, said in a statement celebrating the guilty verdict. In Manhattan, no corporation is above the law. The 12-person jury in New York State Court was sent out to deliberate on Monday morning after a 6-week trial in which Trump Organization lawyers pinned blame for the fraud solely on the greed of long-term Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg. Weisselberg, a former close ally of Trump, accepted a plea deal earlier this year, admitting fraud in exchange for a 5-month prison sentence. Prosecutors laid out a case that was heavily reliant on Weisselberg's testimony. The verdict represents a serious blow to Trump and his family, who rose to fame as property moguls in New York, but whose business practices have long been shadowed in secrecy with rumours of ill-doing. It is also the latest in a raft of legal troubles that surround Trump, including several investigations related to his attempts to overturn the 2020 election victory of Joe Biden and his apparent removal of sensitive White House documents to his Florida resort at Mar-a-Lago. So, William, firstly, this was a case about greed and cheating, Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, said in a statement today. That pretty much sums up Trump and perhaps his appeal to some parts of the electorate in the US. It's all about greed and cheating.
Well, Trump would tell you it's all about being smart. Trump always regarded himself as the smartest person in the room, and he might regard off-the-books perks, which result in lower salaries being payable, which results in lower tax being paid, as a smart move in terms of business. I think if you investigate, I don't mean rigorously investigate, just look at his business record over the years, it's far from impressive. And Trump always talked a good fight, but actually delivering good stuff, not so much. Given Trump's abysmal grasp of detail, one can't be sure how much he actually knew about what was going on. I'm sure he would have approved, but how much he actually knew, big question mark. And of course, Trump isn't personally on trial here. It's just part of a general pattern. And I hope that it does paint Trump over time in the sort of light in which he deserves to be painted. It's far from the smallest, or rather far from the largest, I should say, of his problems, because those are coming down the pipe, and he will be subjected to them fairly soon. I think it will be a sad twilight for him, but I'm struggling to feel any sympathy.
Well, indeed, William. And to tie up the points that you were making earlier, and we're talking about now, the legal woes have to a large extent overshadowed Trump's recent announcement of his new White House run. Though Trump's campaign was launched after great fanfare at Mar-a-Lago, it has not really set the political world alight after high-profile Trump-backed candidates were largely defeated in November's midterm elections, as you said. Numerous rivals to Trump are now emerging in the Republican Party, especially Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So is it fair to say that Trump is now yesterday's man, of no real relevance to the political future of the US, and not the smartest man in the room, nor the centre of attention anymore?
It's possible. It's even likely, but it's not definite, because you never discount somebody who's had a history of getting his way in the way that Donald Trump has. He'll appeal this particular decision, he'll appeal the rest, and he will slow down the proceedings for as much as he possibly can. So it's a case of the old, I think it's a Yogi Berra quote, at least allegedly, it's never over till it's over, and even then it isn't over. And Trump, until he's 6 feet under, will be a factor in the US, I'm afraid.
I'm delighted that you're quoting Yogi Bear. Well, I'll need to go and look up that quotation, but it sounds like Yogi Bear to me. Thank you, William. For our final item this evening, the Met Office has warned of cold air from the Arctic crossing the UK in severe weather warnings for snow and ice. The Met Office Chief Meteorologist, Steve Willington, said, as an Arctic maritime air mass settles across the UK, temperatures will fall with widespread overnight frosts, severe in places, and daytime temperatures only a few degrees above freezing. However, the cold air from the Arctic will also bring brighter conditions, with some dry, sunny spells, particularly away from the coast and where winds are light. It could feel pleasant in the sunshine. Some patchy freezing fog is also likely. The forecasts predict widespread frost and temperatures falling to as low as -10 overnight in remote rural areas. There is concern that the cold weather will have serious consequences for the health of older people and those with pre-existing medical conditions. And that's particularly so in the ongoing cost of living crisis, where the poorest in our society are struggling to find the money to pay to heat and eat. So, William, public health officials are most concerned about the predictable and preventable impact of cold weather. When temperatures plummet, hospitals see more patients with heart attacks, strokes, respiratory infections, including the flu. There's also a greater risk of hypothermia when prolonged exposure to the cold causes body temperature to drop below 35 degrees. And when conditions are icy, of course, there are more falls and related injuries. Now, research from UCL and the University of Bristol found that cold snaps, when the temperature drops for a few days, double the risk of heart attacks and strokes. So all of this doesn't sound good for an already under pressure Scottish NHS, does it?
Yeah, I can see BBC Scotland preparing its figures for next month about A&E. It's going to be a difficult period. Um, it's going to be if you're running a guest hub, you're never sure whether your staff are going to get in. Your volunteers, if it's icy, I'm not even sure I'll get in tomorrow because it's fairly icy down the bottom of my road when the frost hits. So I'll have my wee cleats on the boots to make sure I don't fall on a breakable part of my anatomy. So it's difficult times. Yes, A&E is in for another thrashing, I'm afraid. And all I can say to people is be careful, dress well, dress sensibly, and let's get through this. And let's also remember the people who are rough sleepers. Particularly bad thing in London right now, but rough sleepers here in Perth too, and in other places in Scotland, because it's absolutely going to be not an easily negotiable period of time for them.
Absolutely, William. Now, you mentioned cleats on your boots there. I'm reminded that in 2010, the last really long period of snow and cold weather that we had here in Edinburgh, I eventually went out and bought snow boots and a very heavy-duty parka and took various precautions. And as a result, it's not really snowed in Edinburgh ever since. So in addition to putting on cleats in your boots, what other measures are you going to take, William, both to protect yourself against this particular weather and perhaps in the same way as I do, to prevent bad weather ever happening again, having taken those protections?
Well, I'm going to ask you to buy all sorts of protective things because that seems to do the trick. And if you could move about the country and do that, that would work equally well. So come to Perth because we need you to spend money in the Perth economy. So buy lots of winter stuff and we'll be just fine. The Bridge of Erne microclimate will do its work. My other tactic is to catch a lift from my wife.
Thank you, William. No doubt the next time I'm driving around a certain roundabout in Perth, I will have to stop at a very large outdoor equipment shop and do as you suggest. Thank you. But I'm afraid to say that is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there, and you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Click on the little bell just beneath the screen. Now, we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us again then. And I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening. And of course, I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, William Duguid. Thanks, William.
Thanks for having me, and don't forget to wrap up well, everybody.
Thanks, William. I'm reminded that we saw a new face at PMQs today because speaking in his new role for the first time, Stephen Flynn MP thanked his predecessor, Ian Blackford, before addressing Rishi Sunak, saying, "What does he consider to be the greatest achievement of the Conservative Party in government since 2019? Is it leaving the single market and the customs union? Is it ending freedom of movement? Is it denying Scotland her democracy? Or is it getting the Labour Party to agree with all of the above?" I think Mr Flynn's performance today was an assured one. His relaxed stance and assertive questioning displayed no hint of nerves. He spoke to the whole House, not just to the Prime Minister, and I think importantly for him, the House listened. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.